The rain fell relentlessly, hammering the dark highway and turning it into a treacherous path. Karen Whitfield's car veered sharply, the tires losing traction on the slick pavement. The violent collision was deafening, a brutal interruption to the stillness of the night. Her vehicle lay crumpled at the bottom of a steep embankment, shattered glass reflecting the sporadic flashes of lightning. Emergency responders hurried to the scene, their movements precise and grim, as they pulled Karen's lifeless body from the wreckage. At the crash site, police officers assessed the scene with practiced efficiency. Skid marks on the road, heavy rain, no sign of interference. One officer said as he took notes on his clipboard, "It's straightforward. Just an unfortunate accident caused by the weather." His colleagues nodded in agreement, their voices low with the weight of the tragedy. The case seemed closed before it even began. Mark Whitfield stood apart from the activity, his drenched figure a stark silhouette against the flashing emergency lights. His expression was unreadable, his face betraying neither tears nor visible anguish. Though the weight of his loss pressed heavily on him, there was something in his eyes, a flicker of unease that lingered even as neighbors whispered condolences. "Are you okay, Mark?" A concerned voice broke through the distant hum of voices. He nodded faintly, his gaze fixed on the wreckage. But beneath his stillness, unease festered. Something about this tragedy didn't sit right. When the emergency workers stepped away from the twisted metal, Mark cautiously approached the wreck. His eyes roamed over the destroyed vehicle, searching for something he couldn't name. A faint scuff on the undercarriage caught his attention. The mark was small but out of place, a sharp groove that seemed inconsistent with the crash's trajectory. To the untrained eye, it would have meant nothing, but to Mark, it felt like a whisper of truth buried beneath the obvious. "This isn't right," he muttered to himself, his voice barely audible. As Mark walked away from the scene, fragments of the past clawed their way into his thoughts. Karen's distracted demeanor in recent weeks, her frequent, hurried phone calls late into the night, the unexplained absences, the subtle yet unmistakable shift in her warmth. A cold realization crept over him. The unease he'd felt before her death wasn't imagined. It was the echo of secrets, ones she had worked tirelessly to conceal. Mark's heart ached with grief, but his mind churned with doubt. Karen's death was not an accident, and someone was responsible. The scuff on the car's frame and the memories of her strange behavior pointed to a narrative far more sinister than the one the police had accepted. She wouldn't lose control of the car like that, he whispered under his breath, his voice trembling. The conviction in his tone grew with every word. He resolved to uncover the truth, no matter how painful or dangerous it might be. As Mark drove home from the crash site, his thoughts swirled. Appearances had deceived him before. What else had been hidden from him? The trust that once defined his relationship with Karen now felt fragile, eroded by secrets he hadn't fully grasped until now. Mark's unease wasn't just grief, it was the dawning realization that the tragedy he was mourning wasn't as it seemed. As the rain continued to fall, so too did the first drops of understanding. Betrayal, manipulation, and lies had shaped Karen's final days. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, Karen's phone in his hand. His thumb hovered above the screen as guilt gnawed at him. It felt wrong to invade her privacy, but the unease inside him had become unbearable. A notification caught his eye, a message preview from a number he didn't recognize. "Thinking of you. Last night was perfect." His stomach clenched. Heart pounding, he opened the message thread. The exchanges were intimate, laced with hints of stolen moments and whispered promises. The words blurred as anger and confusion clouded his vision. Later that day, Mark found a crumpled receipt in Karen's purse for a dinner at a restaurant she'd never mentioned. His chest tightened as pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to assemble began falling into place. The text messages haunted him. He couldn't shake the image of Karen laughing with someone else, sharing the kind of connection he thought was theirs alone. Mark paced the living room, his fists clenched at his sides. "Do I confront her?" He muttered aloud. his voice cracking. What if I'm wrong? But a darker thought lingered. What if I'm right? When Karen walked through the door that evening, her smile was warm, but her eyes seemed distant. Mark wanted to ask her outright, but the words lodged in his throat. "Everything okay?" she asked, setting her bag on the counter. "Yeah," he replied, forcing a smile. "Just a long day." The lie tasted bitter, but he couldn't bring himself to shatter the fragile illusion of normalcy. Karen glanced over her shoulder as she stepped into the quiet cafe. The corner table was dimly lit, and Michael sat waiting, his hand casually resting on a cup of coffee. "You're late," he teased, his lips curving into a smirk. "Traffic," Karen replied, sliding into the seat across from him. Her voice was steady, but her fingers trembled as she stirred her tea. Their meetings had become more frequent, their stolen moments laced with both excitement and dread. She hated the lies she told Mark, the excuses that piled up like debris in her mind. At home, Mark noticed her absences more. Another work meeting. He asked one night, his tone neutral but his eyes searching hers. Karen nodded, avoiding his gaze. "It's a busy season." Her distracted demeanor, the way she seemed present, but miles away, it was becoming impossible for Mark to ignore. Michael leaned closer, his voice low and persuasive. "You deserve to be happy, Karen. You said it yourself. Your marriage feels like a cage." Karen hesitated, her heart aching at his words. "It's not that simple," she murmured. "Why not?" Michael pressed, his hand brushing hers. "You're not the same woman you were when you married him. You've grown." Maybe he hasn't. Karen pulled her hand back, guilt flashing across her face. She knew he was wrong, or at least she wanted him to be. But Michael's words planted seeds of doubt, ones that took root and tangled with her unresolved feelings. At home, Mark noticed the subtle changes. The way Karen avoided eye contact, the way her sentences trailed off when he asked about her day. Michael's influence was weaving its way into their lives, eroding what little trust remained. Alone in their dimly lit bedroom, Mark stared at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down on him. His mind raced with questions that had no easy answers. Why wasn't I enough? What did I do wrong? The pain of betrayal cut deep, but so did the shame. He couldn't help but wonder if his own shortcomings had driven Karen away. The next morning, he caught her humming softly as she prepared breakfast. The sound, once comforting, now felt like a mockery. "Karen," he began, his voice hesitant. She turned, a questioning look in her eyes. "Never mind," he said quickly, his courage faltering. He hated himself for his silence, but feared what her response might confirm. Karen sat at her vanity, staring at her reflection. Dark circles framed her eyes, and her lips trembled as she applied lipstick. The face staring back at her felt like that of a stranger. Mark's kindness only made the guilt worse. He still brought her coffee in the mornings, still kissed her cheek before leaving for work. She wanted to confess everything, but the words wouldn't come. At dinner, Mark reached for her hand. "You've seemed off lately. Are you okay?" Karen's throat tightened. She forced a smile. "Just tired," she lied, her voice barely above a whisper. The lie tasted sour, but she couldn't stop. The truth felt like a landslide waiting to bury them both. The once comfortable silence between Mark and Karen turned tense. Conversations became shorter, their interactions laced with unspoken tension. Mark noticed her flinch when his hand brushed hers, the way she avoided his gaze during meals. Karen, in turn, felt the weight of his stares, the unasked questions simmering behind his silence. Their shared life, once a sanctuary, had become a battlefield of secrets and unspoken fears. One night, Mark sat in his car outside their home, gripping the steering wheel tightly. He had made his decision. He couldn't live with the lies any longer. Inside, Karen sat on the couch, her phone clutched in her hands. Her finger hovered over Michael's number, her chest tight with indecision. Both knew the moment of truth was approaching. For better or worse, their lives were about to change forever. Mark's search through Karen's belongings reveals a damning email chain with Michael Ryder. The messages are intimate, confirming their affair. A bank statement shows unexplained transactions tied to Michael, exposing his ulterior motives. The discovery leaves Mark shattered, angered by Karen's betrayal, and determined to uncover the full extent of the deception. Late at night, Mark hears Karen's muffled voice on the phone. Her words are tense, panicked, hinting at trouble. "I can't do this anymore. It's too dangerous." Suspicion sharpens into action as Mark decides to follow her. He knows the situation is unraveling, and he's desperate for answers, no matter the cost. Karen and Michael argue in the car, emotions spiraling out of control. Karen's regret over her choices clashes with Michael's desperation to maintain his hold on her. Accusations escalate to a breaking point. Michael, in a reckless bid to regain control, grabs the steering wheel, sending the car careening off the road. Michael crawls from the wreckage, shaken but unharmed. He hesitates before fleeing, leaving Karen trapped and gravely injured. Karen's thoughts, heavy with guilt and sorrow, drift to Mark as the rain falls. The police arrive, unaware of Michael's role, concluding the crash to be a tragic accident caused by the weather. Piecing together the events leading to the crash, Mark realizes the depth of Karen's affair and Michael's manipulation. Her betrayal, paired with Michael's selfish actions, led to her death. The truth weighs heavily on Mark, filling him with sorrow for Karen and fury toward the man who destroyed her. Mark faces an agonizing choice: expose Michael and tarnish Karen's legacy, or protect her memory and live with the knowledge of what truly happened. He wrestles with his conflicting emotions, loyalty to Karen, the need for justice, and the cost of revealing the truth. The decision he makes will define his future and the story's haunting conclusion. Detective Harris leaned back in his chair, staring at the open case file. Something about the crash didn't sit right. The preliminary reports were tidy, too tidy. Skid marks, rain-soaked roads, no signs of interference. Yet the fragments of Karen Whitfield's life told a story far less straightforward. Harris flipped through his notes. A neighbor had casually mentioned Karen's recent distance from her husband. A coworker hinted at her uncharacteristic lateness and secretive behavior. She seemed distracted, one colleague had offered, his voice hesitant. There was also the matter of the undercarriage damage, subtle but irregular, as if something had struck the car before it left the road. Harris tapped his pen against the desk, his instincts sharpening. This wasn't just bad weather, he muttered under his breath. He resolved to dig deeper. Knowing the truth often lay in the shadows people tried hardest to conceal. Mark sat in the dimly lit living room, Karen's photograph resting on the table before him. Her smile, once comforting, now seemed to mock him. In his mind, the memories of her affair and Michael's involvement played on a loop. He rubbed his temples, the weight of his decision pressing down. Should he come forward with what he knew? If he exposed Karen's infidelity, the world would see her differently. Her reputation, her legacy, it would all crumble. "You deserve better than this," Mark whispered, though the words felt hollow. Did she? His love for her clashed with the sting of her betrayal, leaving him paralyzed by indecision. In the end, he chose silence. Protecting her memory, flawed as it was, felt like the only way to honor their life together. Yet, the burden of the truth settled heavily on his chest, a secret too painful to share. The days stretched into weeks, each one more unbearable than the last. Mark couldn't escape the echoes of Karen's voice or the warmth of her laughter in his memories. Sitting alone in their bedroom, he traced the edge of her wedding ring, which he had kept as a memento. His mind churned with questions he would never have answers to. Had she ever truly loved him? Was there something he had done, or failed to do, that drove her into Michael's arms? His guilt gnawed at him, turning even fond memories into sharp reminders of his inadequacy. He withdrew from friends, dodged concerned calls, and skipped work, unable to face the world with the weight of his secret pressing down on him. Karen's death sent shockwaves through their small town. At her funeral, mourners whispered in hushed tones. Some spoke of her kindness, her charm, her ability to light up a room. Others, however, traded speculations. She seemed so different lately. Someone said quietly, "Do you think she was hiding something?" Mark overheard snippets of gossip wherever he went. Every murmured question, every suspicious glance, felt like a dagger to his already fractured heart. The once pristine image of their life together was tarnished. He couldn't stop it. Sitting at his kitchen table, Mark contemplated the complexity of Karen's story. She had been both a victim and a culprit, manipulated by Michael, yet complicit in her own destruction. He clenched his fists, anger flaring at the thought of Michael walking free. The man had preyed on Karen's vulnerabilities, twisting her love into a weapon. But Mark also couldn't ignore Karen's choices, the lies she told, the life she had hidden from him. The lines between right and wrong blurred, leaving him with no clear path forward. Seeking justice would mean exposing everything, and Mark wasn't sure he had the strength to face that battle. Weeks later, Mark visited Karen's grave. The headstone was simple, etched with her name and the dates that framed her life. He placed a single rose against the stone, his fingers lingering on the cool marble. "I hope you found peace," he said softly, his voice breaking. As he stood there, he made a quiet vow. He would carry the truth alone, even as it ate away at him, knowing that some answers and some wounds were better left buried. Mark sat in the quiet of his living room, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the floor. Karen's photograph rested on the coffee table, a frozen smile that once brought comfort, now a reminder of everything he'd lost. His fingers traced the edge of her frame, his mind drowning in the weight of her secrets. Karen's choices had unraveled their life. Her vulnerability, masked by confidence, had left her susceptible to Michael's manipulative charm. But it wasn't just her deception that broke them. It was the lies they both told themselves, the belief that their love was unshakable, the silence in moments where honesty was needed most. The fallout extended beyond them. Their friends whispered in hushed tones. Their community speculated on the crash. Everyone was left searching for answers, unaware of the truth Mark now carried alone. The delicate threads of trust in their shared life had frayed, leaving scars on everyone touched by their story. As Mark reflected, the question lingered. Who bore the greater blame? Karen, who made choices that betrayed their marriage, or Michael, who exploited her doubts and fears? Karen was not blameless. She had crossed lines, made promises she never intended to keep. Yet, her actions were not born of malice. They stemmed from loneliness, from the emotional void she hadn't known how to fill. Michael, however, had seen her pain and wielded it like a weapon. He had manipulated her, isolating her further from Mark, pushing her toward decisions she couldn't undo. But could Mark call himself innocent? Had his own distance driven her into Michael's orbit? The lines blurred further the longer he thought. Love and betrayal, victim and perpetrator. They had all played their parts in the tragedy. Mark stood at Karen's grave, the cool autumn breeze rustling the leaves around him. In his hand, he held the wedding ring she'd worn until the end. He stared at the polished stone, her name etched into the granite, and felt the weight of the truth settle deeper in his chest. To speak it aloud would shatter her memory. The woman her friends and family loved would become a stranger in their eyes. And what good would justice bring? Michael might face consequences, but it wouldn't undo the damage, wouldn't bring Karen back. Mark closed his eyes, gripping the ring tightly. "I'll carry it," he whispered, "for you." He turned away from the grave, the burden of his silence heavier than ever. Some truths, he realized, were best left buried, not for the sake of justice, but for the sake of those left behind.